Thank you. So thank you very much for us all. Thank you very much to everyone for joining us today. We had a great week last week with the talks, and the other weeks have been fantastic too. Thank you for everyone's questions. Absolutely amazing, the interaction that we've had. And today it's a great delight to have Carol Adams with us. It's an absolute honour to have Carol. Carol Adams is an author, a speaker, and an activist with a master's in divinity from Yale Divinity School. And her work focuses on social justice, including women's rights and animal rights, as well as racism, domestic violence, and homelessness too. She's the author of several books, including The Sexual Politics of Meat, Neither Man Nor Beast, Feminism and the Defense of Animals, and The Pornography of Meat. And as a writer, feminist and animal rights activist, she focuses in particular on what she argues are the links between the oppression of women and that of non-human animals. And she was inducted into the Animal Rights Hall of Fame in 2011. As I said, it's a great honour to have her here. I, for one, have been heavily influenced by Carol Adams's work, so it's absolute delight that I introduce her talk, which is entitled Reflections on a Feminist Vegan Critical Theory. Okay, so thank you, Carol.
Hi, everybody, and thank you for all the work that both of you have put in to make this summer workshop semester study so successful. And I'm looking forward to the questions and conversations we'll have in the next hour. I put together something a little more personal than most of my talks, because I know a lot of my works are available, but I thought in talking with your organizers a few months ago, one of the questions that was posed to me was, well, how do you talk about oppressions being connected once you realize that's the case? If you realize that oppressions are connected in some form, how does one discuss it, point it out, explain it? So thinking about that, I thought I'd tell you about how I came to write The Sexual Politics of Meat and the kind of struggles I faced articulating a theory, a feminist vegan critical theory. I do want to say that after Sexual Politics of Meat appeared, I began to get many images sent to me. I'll talk a little more about it. But as a result, I'll be using images that are recent and contemporary to our time that illustrate my points, though I did not have them available to me when I was developing the theory. And as a result as well, I just want to give a little content warning. You're going to see some images that are pretty common, or they're sort of the wallpaper of many of our lives. And when you see them in the aggregate being pointed out, it might be a little more overwhelming than when you walk down in the street and see a billboard or a menu. So just wanted to make sure you had a content warning. I'm going to share my screen, find my presentation, share it, and we'll begin. So it is a task to come to see the world as it is. That's certainly true for those of us trying to articulate and critique the dominant culture that is so filled with various forms of oppression. And that was the problem I faced in 1974 when I realized there was a connection between living in a patriarchal world and eating animals. It's the problem I still face. How do we articulate this? So The Sexual Politics of Meat was my first answer to that question. I'm on Twitter, and someone said, how long did it take you to write Sexual Politics of Meat? I'm not quite halfway through, dead stuff, but love it though. Well, it took me 15 years to figure out the 3 aspects of the book I needed to figure out. So once I had the idea that meat eating arose within a patriarchal society, and there was a connection between feminism and vegetarianism in 74, I would say feminism and veganism now, I realized in the process of writing the book, I had to do three things. First, I had to figure out my theory. What was my theory? At first, my writing seemed to simply make connections, and I felt that was inadequate. Something is like something else. What was the point if I simply said, well, men are the majority of hunters in Western society? Why was that? What was going on behind there? Or men talk about women as though they are meat. What is what's going on behind that? Besides feeling like I needed to have a theoretical understanding, the next question was, how do I talk about my theory? How was I going to take the theory and make it into a narrative? And that was arduous. And finally, what was my tone? Angry, passive, scholarly, academic, in your face. About 1988, the book came out in 1990, I realized that I was very angry. And two things happened. One was that I knew that no one wants to read someone else's pure anger or bare anger. That it was becoming a screed, that my role was to help other people feel angry, not take care of my anger. So that's an important part of thinking about interconnected oppressions, because once you do, you can feel really angry, like, oh my God, why don't people see it, etc. And the other revelation that occurred was that if everybody saw it, I'd have nothing to write about. So I should just get back to work. But in 1976, I had an offer to write a book. I had already done an article on feminism and vegetarianism called The Edible Complex. And a small publisher approached me and said they'd do it as a book. And this is the wonderful poster that was developed to help advertise the book in 1976. Here are some of my notes for the book, The Edible Complex, or One Man's Meat is Every Woman's Poison, and just some ideas that I had back in 76. In 76, in the spring, I interviewed about 50 feminists in the Boston, Cambridge area who I knew were vegetarian, about why they were vegetarian. And I was going to draw on that in this first book that never was published. But one of the people I interviewed was Florence Luscombe. You can see she was born in 1892. She heard Susan B. Anthony speak in the 19th century. But she was friends with Agnes Ryan. And if you know Sexual Politics of Meat, you know that Agnes Ryan was a suffragist who was also a vegetarian and made connections between feminism and vegetarianism in the early 20th century. So I interviewed Florence, who lived in the Boston area, and she's saying to me, it seemed relatively unimportant, Agnes's vegetarianism. We never discussed her vegetarianism. So I thought, I'm just collecting information at this point. I also went to the Schlesinger Library, this great resource of women's history, which is right in Cambridge. And I was looking for 19th century vegetarian feminists. This is an example of, an early note on that, Mary Gove Nichols, who was vegetarian and also for dress reform. So, I should just go back and just say that I kept collecting all this information. But one of the things I realized is that feminist historians weren't noting when, or were noting just in passing if someone was vegetarian, or they'd call it a fad diet. And yet here it was recurring over and over again. So how could it be a fad? So this all becomes part of the latter part of Sexual Politics of Meat. Redrafts of it wasn't good, that I'd probably only have one chance to make the case for what I perceived, and that this was not adequate. So I pulled it, I stopped production, and I became an activist, but I still continued to work on the book. This This is an article that appeared in Vegetarian Times in 1979. It was a leading vegetarian paper, and I'd sent them this story about a confrontation in a 1907 women's suffrage convention about vegetarianism and wearing hats that had bird feathers in it. Sorry. And, you know, they certainly didn't know what to do with it, because look at the image that went along with it. Here I'm talking about feminism and vegetarianism, and right there is this bodybuilding person. I became an activist. I was very involved in social justice issues in Western New York, was the executive director of an agency, became very involved in challenging a small city in Western New York that wasn't building the public housing it had promised. And I thought education was the way to help people understand public housing wasn't going to change their property values. Of course, it really wasn't about property values. It was about racism. And so I'm trying to tell people they're violating the Fair Housing Act. And as the newspaper subheadline says, booze rang out as I talked. Well, I can tell you that having booze ring out was one of the best preparations for me for once the Sexual Politics of Meat came out, because so many people hated it. So not only did my activism prepare me for being the author of a controversial book, but more importantly, the activism kept me grounded in what theory needs to be doing about lives and living. That theory isn't something up here and our activism is down here, but that theory helps to explicate or helps us understand why we are on the front lines of you know, challenging pipelines and animal agriculture and sexual exploitation. Here was another headline. If this racism continues, there's no guarantee that when the low-income housing is built that it will go to the poor. So this is a Buffalo paper. They didn't even know how to handle that I'd kept my own name. So I was Mrs. Carol Adams. But again, the anti-housing people just held on to this at such a deep level. They could not understand in 1980 why someone would not take their husband's name. So they speculated on the local radio station that I had kept my own name because I had married an African-American man. So that in a sense, the only way they could explain my feminism was to attribute racism to it. It was a complicated time. I taught a course at the local college on women's studies. I wasn't a professor. I've never actually truly been part of an academic environment or university, but this was the headline. Anyway, this is Feminism and Vegetarianism, 1982. So at this point, there was a very famous article about as male to female as nature, as culture is to nature by Sherry Ortner. It came out during the second wave. And I spent a lot of time trying to figure out, is vegetarianism to meat eating as female is to male, as nature is to culture? Of course, we know that there is really not just two genders, that the gender binary is false, that these kind of conceptualizations don't work. Well, they did not work. And I did not use any of this in the Sexual Politics of Meat, but I was kind of trying to think about where do all the interconnections appear in myths and anthropological studies, taboos. So just, you know, I went through drafts and drafts and drafts. Here's an early draft. This is before I had discovered the concept of the absent referent. And I'm struggling to find a description of the connection between sexism and speciesism. I didn't call it interconnected oppressions at this point. And here is where I'm trying to call it a crossover where two train tracks meet. It's the struggle to how to name interconnections. It reminds me of this fragment, reminds me of the challenges of working on these ideas in the early 1980s. And here, this is how I edit. I still edit this way, printing things out and stapling them to a new piece of paper when I'm adding stuff. But this did not make it into Sexual Politics of Meat either, but I just thought it was interesting, this story about Thomas Jefferson and how he mourned his wife by, with this dead bird. I didn't do anything with it, but again, I'm trying to look for all the kinds of examples so that I know how broadly theoretical I have to be about what's going on. I wrote a grant request. I thought I had a good chance. I didn't get it. But this is 1986, and I had forgotten completely about this till a couple of years ago when I found it. And I love that I wrote, I believe I can break new and important ground, but I need the opportunity to do so because I was so busy as an activist. We'd also started a hotline for battered women. We were working with homelessness and migrant workers. And, I didn't have a lot of time to write. It's interesting because when the book came out, immediately was called groundbreaking. Now, as an ecofeminist, I know that term is connected to settler colonialism and the use of the land, and I would not use it now. Other ecofeminists have called the book generative, which I love since it's coming from plant-based culture. But I was just shocked that I had that much confidence in myself in 1986. Also, I was concerned about what kind of vegetarianism were we going to have in 10 years? That we would have more vegetarianism than in 1986, but what kind? Was it going to be really limited in the way it looked at the world? And so I just kept working. Then we moved to Texas. This is a Chicken Lady. Chicken Lady was part of Off Our Backs, a very important feminist newspaper. And in the late 80s, I put out this call for a book exploring the history of the intersection of feminism and vegetarianism. And I just love the image they did. I want to grow up in a nuclear-free zone, and the other chicken saying, I want to grow up in a fryer-free world. Really sort of wonderful. When we moved to Texas, I was reading this book, Bearing the Word. I'm trying to figure out why Frankenstein's monster is a vegetarian. Why did Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley make the monster vegetarian? So I'm reading everything possible that I can on the monster and the novel and Shelley and Percy Shelley, who was a vegetarian. And at first I thought she was just mocking Shelley, but of course, when you look at the book, you'll see I figured out it was much deeper than that. Anyway, on about page 8, we were in Arkansas. I read about the absent referent, which is a literary concept that, so for instance, Wordsworth goes for a walk in England and sees daffodils. He doesn't write a poem about daffodils till he's away from the daffodils. When he's in their presence, he's experiencing them. It's only when they're absent that they provoke the poem. So they're absent reference. And I remember putting the book down and thinking, that's what animals are. And I went to sleep with the book next to the bed table. And I must have processed this in my subconscious, because when I woke up, I knew that that's what women are too in a patriarchal culture, absent reference. So that's 1987. And so finally, I think I have a theory that brings everything together, the function of the absent referent. This is something I write to someone who's reading an early version of chapter 2. Do you think I'm onto something solid with the absent referent? I'm looking for sort of some feedback on, have I gone off the deep end or not? Remember, now I've been working on this for more than a decade. So the other thing that I realized once I came up with the absent referent, I realized that nothing existed to help me formulate this. I mean, lots existed. There were writings, feminist writings and animal rights writings, but there was nothing on which I could build my theory, or that's what it felt. So that's when I realized I needed to make some things up. I could invent things. I could invent words, and I could invent analysis. And that was very liberating. It took me to a whole new level in terms of writing. So when The Sexual Politics of Meat was published, or it won this Women's Studies Award in 1989. And when it was taken to back then, when we had lots of bookstores, publishers had book reps, as they were called. And books that are top on the publisher's list get presented to these book reps, a whole room of book reps. And the book reps heard about my book, that's presented as one for them to go convince booksellers to buy and have available. And the book reps all said, you're going to have some sort of image on this cover, because at that point it did not have an image. We don't know what to do with this book. So that's how this image ended up on the cover, practicing the sort of politics of feminism. When you have a negative image, you surround it with text and you make it small. You surround it with interpretation to try to disempower it. This is the other image in the book. It's black and white, so it's not quite as shocking. You can see that this is the image that starts chapter 2, that this pig's trotters have even been, toenails have been painted red, a true exploitation in which the sexualized woman is the absent referent. So what happened with these two images, this is an example of the animal as the absent referent and women being seen as meat. So it wasn't just that men saw women as meat, but that the whole issue of looking at animals as meat has to come first to then look at women as meat. These two images and the theory that appeared in 1990 set something in motion that still has sort of entangled me because I was talking about overlapping oppressions. The first chapter is concerned with the more predictable aspect of the sexual politics of meat. And often when you hear someone say, oh, that's sexual politics of meat, it's often having to do with the association of manliness or masculinity with meat eating. So in terms of meat and masculinity, the question is, well, what's manly and who's a real man? And it's as though these identities are static, that you can eat like a man, that there's one thing a man is supposed to be. And especially it's about white men. The way to a man's heart is through his stomach. I mean, women have been taught this for years and years and years. But again, it's what's interesting is the dynamics in which the presumption of a gender binary helps to legitimize the sexual politics of meat, and the sexual politics of meat builds on and reinforces a gender binary that's false. So all of this anxiety, man up for 2 times the bacon, all of that is about anxiety, the anxiety of masculinity. Oh, sorry, hold on just a second. It's in the sun. It's about, so if you have to man up, that means that something's happened that caused you to man down. Of course, there's all this phallic imagery going on in this language, but what's caused this issue? And in a sense, it's showing the destabilizing of masculinity that's happened because of feminism and other forces, late capitalism. So the very fact that something I identified in 1990, the sexual politics of meat working in this way, that's still evidencing itself in 2021, shows that masculinity is constantly reinventing itself, having to reclaim something that's essential that clearly isn't essential, because if it were essential, it wouldn't have to be reclaimed. So the very efforts to proclaim meat eating and masculinity shows that it's already gone. This is 2 years ago. Nothing says Happy Father's Day better than a meat on a stick. The phallic imagery that appears around this and the language, it's just not even subtle. Now, this one, I just really love putting, this is from England. This isn't even about meat eating. This is about beer. Putting together a barbecue, you get 374 man points, but cooking tofu sausages on it, minus 417. So a whole afternoon of putting a barbecue together is completely vitiated if you put tofu sausages on it. So 1 pound of tofu sausages is equal to 6 or 7 hours of man's labor. I mean, that shows a lot of power in tofu. Eat more tofu sausages, I would say. But here's something from 2 years ago or 3 years ago, T-bone, not tofu, for a gentleman's day in Germany. So the question is, why is this hostility to tofu? And it's because tofu offers protein and it destabilizes male identified Western protein. So in the 19th century, as I talk about, rice eaters, tofu eaters, they were seen as effeminate. They were the conquered. This was the explanation for the success of British colonialism. But here's tofu really threatening meat eating. And so it's got to sort of be put in its place or objected. The other thing that happens with the sexual politics of meat, and yes, this is me taking a photo. My son took this. So good, even guys like our salads. Like, let's have a little misogyny with our salad if we're men. That women are indiscriminate and women will eat any kind of salad, but only men will eat really good salads. So you've got misogyny happening all over. So the assumption that you need animal protein is a racist presumption. I say that in the first chapter. It's a racist presumption, what we have from Western culture that's promulgated throughout the world now. So the sexual politics of meat, men need meat, Western colonial male identified meat eating, patrolling and protecting the gender binary, and then the objection of the colonized seen as rice or tofu eaters. And what's happened is that this link between meat eating and notions of masculinity and virility in the Western world has now been studied by academics, confirming the sexual politics of meat. But in their findings, rather than saying, hey, this is a cultural construction and we are finding this because it's a cultural construction, some of the articles seem to naturalize it too, resulting in the dominant media, when they pick up on it, reinforcing the idea that real men eat meat. There's nothing inevitable about men eating meat. Even this question, is meat male, reinforces the gender binary. And then this was a recent study. It wasn't very good. It was done in England. Men fear social shame of ordering vegetarian dishes, study finds. I think it's more complicated than that. But what's fascinating is here, eating meat is about virility and courage and all that. And men are supposed to already be courageous and virile, but they are so shamed about eating vegetarian dishes that they fail to do it. Yet who should really have the shame? The men who think strength comes from killing plant-eating animals cruelly. I mean, look at the cow. The cow is cast as this placid being, though take her baby away and she's much less placid. But here's this placid being who supposedly transforms into a T-bone steak that makes you virile, and yet it's a very cowardly act to kill an animal and to have someone else kill the animal. So all the discrepancies of the sexual politics of meat, you could have 500 more books that explore it. In the book, I take the idea that animals are the absent referent and explain what I mean. It, they're absent reference and renamed. So this is probably one of the most famous examples of someone recognizing how absent referent structure is working to keep the person from doing the connection that Lisa Simpson makes between the dead meat on the plate and the living lamb she met. And then here, what I said, butchered animals are the absent referent. So, and here, sexualized women are the absent referent. So this, through the absent referent, I'm able to show these interconnected oppressions because one aspect of oppression against a group of beings is applied and intensifies the oppression of another group of beings. Only after Sexual Politics of Meat came out did I realize that the people who, they probably had to drug the pig or kill this pig to do this, put panties on her, was based on Titian's famous Venus. But many steak restaurants and other places like to use this image. So here's a steakhouse in Brooklyn from a few years ago. So sexualized women are the absent referent. They're getting, in a sense, they're getting to be able to talk about women's bodies without being honest about it. In a patriarchal culture, you put it on animals and all of this misogyny can circulate without truly being recognized. This was a restaurant in Manchester that's closed, but this is how they directed you upstairs to eat the hamburger. You'll see this. If you see images like this, please do send them to me. But fishnet stockings, high heels, pearls, all these sort of stereotypical feminine articles of apparel and wear become attached to animals because they want to intensify the objectification of the animal. Not only is she already dead, but she wants you to want her, which is so interesting. Animal rights activists, we've been called anthropomorphic because supposedly we attribute human feelings to animals. But the real anthropomorphism is going on in all these advertisements that imply that that animals have feelings. The only feelings they're attributed to have is the desire to be desired, that animals want us to consume them, you know, a huge lie. And the only time we credit them with this desire is once they're dead. But these appear in a variety of places. Here is a transport truck, and you look at this image, maybe you were driving behind it in Europe, and you think, oh, those are live pigs in there. And then you see this, and the humor helps to take away whatever awareness you had, especially if you're heterosexually inclined as a man, to then laugh at this image. So it's distracting us from this, that pigs are being transported without water, they're hot, they're crowded, they don't want to be in there. So this is how women and animals become overlapping absent reference. Here's a t-shirt from Wyoming from a gas station. Stand up and take it like a woman. Take what? I mean, the presumption of male prerogative and male perspective are both there, as well as violence. This is also very interesting, that when a woman is in a pose of submission, and whether this is a rape fantasy we're seeing or just a form of dominance, the man clothed, the woman less than fully clothed. Once you move that positioning of the woman and make it into a non-human animal, the man has to be removed. Otherwise, there'd be the taint of bestiality. So you've got a sort of reinforcement of a male dominant heterosexuality that's evoked without having to have the man there. The man, the white heterosexual man motivates the image, but is absent from the image. Then, of course, you've got this presumptions about sexuality that map heterosexuality and male dominance. And I talk more about this in the new edition of The Pornography of Meat, which came out last year, the second of the last chapter, that the presumption is that animals would have sex like male dominant humans, and that female animals don't say no, which they can say no. They can walk away if they're not trapped or imprisoned, and that all animals are heterosexual, which we know isn't true. So not only is this a lie about human sexual behavior predicated on patriarchal notions, but it's a lie about animals as well. Chapter 2, as you know, talks about fragmentation and oppression. This image is from just down the street, that we're trained to look at objects through the sexual politics of meat and to desire to consume those objects, even though these objects are or were living beings. But again, who motivated an image like this? That the way to think about a lobster is to think of a buxom lobster. Here, the male gaze is represented. Of course, who's clothed and who's not. This is a sort of interesting reversal here. There's lots of double entendres that are used around fragmentation and consumption. They enact misogyny while supposedly referring to other animals. This is the cover of a food magazine. There's those high heels again, and the redness. These are sort of the tropes of oppression. Everybody loves big breasts. Well, not everybody. It's a normalizing and naturalizing of looking at animals this way and women without, honestly stating it. Who says taste and health can't go together? I mean, it couldn't be more explicit than this of looking at women as fragmented body parts and looking at dead animals that way as well. But the more things change, the more things stayed the same. This image is from the 1980s, a mural in Manhattan that I used on the first edition of The Pornography of Meat. And here it is from a couple years ago. Eat me. This is what I call chalk misogyny. It's a spontaneous image made by one restaurant in Los Angeles, reflecting a culture's dismissal of women's autonomy. We don't have to look to large meat, dairy, and dead fish companies to find these exploitative, misogynist messages. They're everywhere. Again, look, you've got red high heels, you've got fishnet, you've got a being who can't speak, but still wants to be consumed. Headless women, well, don't even get me started how popular headless women are in patriarchal culture. So interconnected oppressions are operating when one absent referent is used to intensify and heighten the oppression of another. So here's an example of a word I made up. In the 19th century, there was a term animalized protein, and I felt that vegetarians of the 19th century used that term to show that the protein is vegetable and then it's put through an animal. Well, then didn't we need a word for the protein extracted from cows and the eggs taken from chickens? So I coined feminized protein to call attention to the problematic use by humans of the nursing material extracted from cows and goats and eggs from chickens. So it's naming the exploitation of female animals' reproductive cycles to produce food. So in conventional attitudes, these female animals disappear from concern, partly because they are alive, and partly because they're female, and partly because so much of the sexual commodification they experience is invisible. So using terms like nursing materials of a cow, mammalian milk, these are attempts at naming that include the individual who's required to produce it. An entire underbelly of force is at work in the taking of and production of mammalian milk, which I get into more in the pornography of meat. But for the cow, the sphere of production and the sphere of reproduction are the same. The alienated labor of the cow is that the product she must produce is from her own body, calves and her milk, and then eventually it is her body at death. But here, this image, which is also taken from a Botticelli's Venus this time, not Titian's, they don't even show the organ from which all that milk she's surrounded by has come. It's as though the milk companies themselves want to deny and be prudish or shy about where they're taking the milk from. It's from udders, and they don't even show. I mean, of course, cows aren't bipedal either. Advertisements for milk try to reconceptualize the relationship as being between the cow and us. Like her calves who are removed so that the milk can become a product, the experience of the cow must be hidden. This image is from France. In the original image from the United States from World War II, Rosie the Riveter announced, "We can do it." Her noun and her verb referred to the collective work efforts of women. With the "You can drink it" postcard, the cow's work at producing milk disappears, and the relationship is between the consumer and the product. We are supposed to believe this mammalian milk is meant for us. It's your liberation I seek, Rosie says. You can do it, Rosie, the cow says. Some advertisements remove the cow too to imply the relationship is simply really between us and the milk, but it's not. This one from Ireland a couple years ago is so fascinating because white men are being associated with the purity of the lactation of other females. You've got all this whiteness. I'm sure you all know that milk drinking, the enzyme that allows you to digest cow's milk, is found in descendants of Europeans. So it's white. It's white in itself. The majority of people in the world cannot digest mammalian milk. So this whiteness has a second meaning, as well is this pastoral image, as though that's how the cows are living, when of course they aren't. And the role of cows in creating the climate apocalypse is denied by this pastoral image. So the cow's job is not producing babies. She has to produce babies to keep her milk supply flowing. So here we've got, you can drink it on the one side, and drinking cow's milk is all about love on the other side, says the nursing material itself for Irish Dairy. So you've got the female laborer and the white male beneficiary of the work, the worker's factory environment, the consumer's supposed pastoral environment. So you've got iconic feminist imagery twisted to imply labor as freedom for a cow and consumption as liberation for a consumer. So Rosie the cow gives permission to exploit her. Rural pastoral imagery without a cow in sight gives us permission to believe cows do not contribute to climate change. So because the cow's job is not producing babies, the babies have to be removed. So the veal calves become absent reference. Those are some of the interventions about interconnected oppressions my book made and that I've continued to make based on my work in the past 31 years. After the book was published, several interesting things happened. Well, they continue to happen. The book was stopped at the Canadian border for being pornographic. This is a very bad faxed copy from 1990 of the original Globe and Mail article from Toronto that is reporting that the book was stopped at the border. They weren't going to let it into Canada. The image on the cover in the United States wasn't allowed. This is the first edition of Polity Press's version of The Sexual Politics of Meat. So the book came out in the US, and then Polity Press brought it out in UK, but they would not use that image. So what we've got is sort of a patriarchal reminder of the 19th century. They couldn't even get to the 20th century. And then, of course, reviewers loved to hate it. Of probably 100 reviews that happened around the world, I'd say 80% hated it. So this one said Dottie title of the month, the London Sunday Express. This one, the National Review, of course, that's a conservative publication in the US. If you thought you'd heard everything, you're wrong. And then this, a whole page by Aubrey Moore, that where he just gets so carried away. He hates it so much, but they let him hate it for a whole page, which I thought, well, it took him a whole page to hate it. And he imagines that everybody in the book, the people I talk about, my spouse and my kids are all figments of my imagination, that I'm some Eastern European emigre, you know, so he's abjecting me. And then Rush Limbaugh, who hated it for many years, tried to get me stopped from speaking on college campuses. And really, one summer, just spent a lot of that summer, 91, I think it was, hating the book. I've met an academic a few years ago who that year was driving a truck to deliver bread in Dallas, and the radio was broken and only played that station. And he had always wondered how that, if it bothered me that Limbaugh spent so much time talking about my book. And I said, well, I did not listen to it. But also, when you're hated for pushing racism in the 1980s and people know where you live, being hated abstractly by someone like Rush, who I saw as a buffoon, didn't bother me at all. Most importantly, my mail changed. I began to hear from readers from around the world who sent me examples and photographs of what I was talking about. I call them grassroots sociologists. The fact is, when I finished writing The Sexual Politics of Meat after 15 years, I thought, well, that's done. Now what will I work on? And then the mail started coming in, and it hasn't stopped. And when I looked at the images, I thought, whoa. And then there's something going on in this image I need to discuss. So my grassroots sociologists recognize that how we look at other beings is influenced by oppressive attitudes, and that I had more work to do. So when I realized my work wasn't done, this led me to study representations, not only because we live in a visual culture, but because sometimes representations demonstrate the oppressive worldview of culture. And as well, the art motifs that are often used in advertising. I also started using work by feminist artists in my book to try to counter the visual objectification and oppression with visual liberation. So even a book like Neither Man Nor Beast has gone through 3 images. The newest one, the one that's red, is coming out soon. Bloomsbury's redoing their covers for their Revelation series. But that first image that shows an anorexic calf, it's so misogynist, because what it is holding up, an old fat cow. It's imitating a weight loss ad. I used to be an old cow, but now look at me. I'm anorexic. So it's glorifying the anorexic female body in a very sick way. It appeared in the New York Times as an image illustrating a recipe for low-fat hamburger. One of the first artists who reached out to me, Susan K. Grant, had done a immersive installation about animals, which I went to, and then I used some of her images in Neither Man Nor Beast. She's also the person who suggested that I put all my images together and make a slideshow. So without her, I don't know if I ever would have started the Sexual Politics of Meat slideshow, which was first shown in 1995. Images like these now appear to advertise my slideshow, or did when I traveled and there wasn't a pandemic. And the question is, how these both resist and participate in the sexual politics of meat. So I gathered all the images, and the pornography of meat came out. And that happened because my publisher said, take your slideshow and make it into a book. So the images I got sent first became the slideshow, and now the slideshow became a book again. So I've come full circle almost, 210 images there. And in it, I did use some of the resistance images that feminist artists were sending me. Like this one, Olivia says, no, the young child does not want to drink mammalian milk. This is hard to see. It's Nancy Hill, the Chicago artist, Chicken, Bitch, and Bunny, which was in the first edition. This is in the new edition, My Body is Mine, Janelle O'Rourke. She goes around and plasters these images of chickens and pigs and rabbits at abattoirs or former abattoirs in Brooklyn, New York. And this is the work of Susie Gonzalez, a very talented San Antonio Latinx artist. And I was speaking down there. So we were carrying her art to where I was speaking. We became a sort of walking art exhibit protest, which was wonderful. Artists themselves responded to recorded documentation of oppression, like photojournalist Joanne MacArthur's powerful series of images of a veal calf being removed from her mother. So Janelle did this veal calf wheelbarrow, which is trying to illustrate the absent reference. She's replaced the calf being removed with all the words that are used in food advertisements that are selling dead calves. Eventually, a book came out of based on the work of feminist artists who were inspired by the sexual politics of meat. And of course, I loved it. Oh, I have the same shirt on. And then there was an art exhibit in Los Angeles of the artists, which was just incredible. It felt like birthday and Christmas and all the holidays put together. That's why I'm glowing. How does someone become something? A question I ask in chapter 2. So have things changed? As I've suggested, they have and they have not. Consider this pig. I ate a pig. Of course, the misogyny of this. We could talk about fraternities and how they talk about pigs, and I do all that in the pornography of meat. And here's this image 30 years later, almost the same pose. So the context of multiple oppressions hasn't changed, so the images aren't going to change. And to help me understand that, I looked at Michael Harris's Colored Pictures, Race and Visual Representation. He says that these images operate within patriarchal structures with a white male perspective as universal and the appropriation of female bodies. So here's an example. You've got here a lot of pinkness you'll see. This, because what Harris has described is what motivates or is behind many of the images that appear because of the sexual politics of meat, these assumptions of the male perspective, the white male perspective is universal. So you get a lot of pinkness. This is from France, a fetishism of pinkness, which is representing femininity. Again, the dead being is the only one allowed to have opinions or have words. And whiteness, you've got a lot of whiteness that's going on here. Here is pinkness associated with the breast cancer campaigns that originated out of the Susan Komen Foundation, where you pinked in October. So here you have Quit Staring at My Rack, where the rack is a dead animal rather than a rack being breasts, which already is objectifying the woman and then using the objectification of the animal. I'm sure you get that at this point. But it's just fascinating that the pinking is participating in sexual politics of meat too. Like this, Hutches for Hope, trying to educate about breast cancer in farm communities, and they pinked the veal crates. So here's the calf who would never be outside. The calf would be imprisoned inside the crate. It's made to look like a doghouse. And here's the happy white family. So a little more about whiteness. Um, there's the virginal whiteness that's going to be evoked here. This is the University of Chicago just before the pandemic last year. You've got a little blood splatter as though she's just been, so-called deflowered. She's got a phallic symbol in her right hand. Or this from Birmingham, all these white panties. Of course, you don't want any white panties to get soiled by, say, menstrual blood or something. So they've got to be completely white. And they're advertising simply that they're going to have a different entrance to a restaurant. Again, the misogyny, the presumptions of owning women's bodies, all of that's there. So the use of wild animals is often invoked when women of color are being presented. Notice the cheetah-like or jaguar-like spots for this Caribbean restaurant. Here's beaver is often used in reference to African-American women. So the intersection of race, gender, and species is always happening. It's our job to ask what's going on here with any image. So we could say women are animalized and racialized, and animals are feminized, sexualized, and racialized. And we can look for that and then say, what particularly is it telling us, any image? Because a human-animal binary has always functioned in racist and misogynistic logic. So finally, I just want to touch a little on the sexual politics of meat getting a new life, new reinforcement from the right wing in the United States. And what they do is show that the assumptions about the sexual politics of meat have always been regressive and retrograde. So these people, these men met with Trump at Bedminster, his New Jersey country club that actually employed undocumented immigrants. But here they are trying to reinforce the idea that this is America, we eat meat, we drink beer, and we speak effing English. That's one of the patches on this guy. So there's the sexual politics of meat, all tied up in xenophobia and anti-immigrant attitudes. So then they talk, then suddenly there was an analysis about why right-wingers are going crazy about meat. But the fact is that it's not about, they're saying it's about panic. It's really about reinscribing masculinity. Again, masculinity is always coming under attack. So you've got to prop it up. Last year in the campaign, Pence warned that Harris was going to take away people's meat. It just, talk about a red flag. Don't take away our meat, because the meat is identified with the male subject here in the United States. So you've got things like milk is the new creamy symbol of white racial purity in Donald Trump's America. And then people said, oh, they're just choosing that. They're just choosing milk. No, milk has a function because, we must secure the existence of our people and a future for lactose tolerant children. So it's part of their really white supremacy inscribed through what they're drinking. So Western cultures co-constructed meat-eating, drinking mammalian milk, masculinity, nationhood, and white supremacy, and our job is to continually expose and explain that. When you see something like eat beef, the West wasn't one on salad, which is very popular in the United States in beef packing towns. This is a lie. The West wasn't won. It was stolen. It required killing and lying and destroying Native American culture and killing buffaloes. It's all part of a huge lie about how settler colonialism worked. So here's the pornography of meat. With all these developments and my expanding understanding, a new edition of The Pornography of Meat was needed. It came out last year with more than 300 images. So just to remind you, none of these images are about advertisements per se. They're using advertisements and other representations to illustrate the prevailing attitudes that are so accepted, we don't see them. They're the wallpaper of our lives. To end on a lighter note, I continued showing the slideshow, and sometimes it seemed the images reinforced what I was challenging rather than challenging it. And then this image appeared. This image was manufactured for Law and Order SVU. Why was a murder victim obsessed with women's butts? The rear entry pose, as I've called it in the pornography of meat. She had images like this pinned to her bulletin board. The beef episode on April 2010 needed to answer the question to discover her murderer. So the Law and Order team went to a book signing in Greenwich Village, where lo and behold, a woman is seen showing slides and saying, our society views women and animals pretty much the same as cuts of meat. She clicks and moves to the next slide. She says, meat eating and the patriarchal world go hand in hand. She says, we can't stop the objectification of women until we stop eating our four-legged and winged brothers and sisters. So what in a world of images is going on here? Do you think I should wear a scarf? The answer for Law and Order detectives is that the speaker is the author of a feminist book on meat eating, and needed an image for the cover of her book. And the rear entry position was seen as perfect. Law and Order recognizes the almost uncanny persistence of these images and needed them for its plot. But here I am, there at Harvard and here in my study, and my Law and Order fictional counterpart. And I'm saying through the sexual politics of meat and the pornography of meat, we are committing discursive violence, which allows for a material form of violence. I'm not just asking us to look with resistance, to recognize that images can't be unanchored from their referent. I'm asking us to refuse to consume the images on their own terms. Refuse to be an accomplice. Don't lies. Don't keep your eyes shut. So Simone Weil says, all our neighbor requires of us is to ask, what are you going through, and be willing to listen to the answer. So I'm going to end by just summarizing the feminist vegan ethic of care. It asks, what are you going through? And it recognizes a being might not be able to say it in words, but we can tell a cow chasing a calf is saying something. We see someone, not something. Ends do not justify the means. And identity is not constructed through anxiety and exceptionalism, but through connection. If you want to read more about the feminist ethics of care, the feminist care tradition in animal ethics offers that. And it's not, there we go, sorry. And finally, to understand all of this within the context of ecofeminist history and the basic concepts of ecofeminist feminism, I'll call your attention to this new volume coming out at the end of the year, which has a long chapter called Ecofeminist Footings, in which Lori Gruen and I provide an overview of ecofeminist theory and its history. So to talk about veganism is to threaten the pillars of patriarchy, and it's based on activism, feminist ethics of care, feminist consciousness, and vegan practices. Here's my final tweet. I love this. Hello, Earthlings. Let's all read The Sexual Politics of Meat and then meet back here for a do-over.